Hi there. Whoa, that's a little loud. My name's Will Bucher, and today I'm going to be speaking with you guys about social media influencers in non-traditional marketing. Specifically, I'm going to talk about how you can promote your game or promote your personal image as an influencer while also complying with the law. So before I do that, I'll give you a very brief introduction about myself. I work at a law firm called Divergent Prompting, and what I do is what we call IP litigation. That's a fancy word for I deal with companies who are already in disputes. That means they're arguing with another company about copyright or trademark, and increasingly, those disputes are with the FTC. That's the Federal Trade Commission, and they're the entity that's responsible for deciding when a social media post needs a disclosure and what that disclosure should look like. So today, when I talk about social media influencers in non-traditional marketing, I want to be clear what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a lot of things. I'm talking about your grandmother's Yelp review, and I'm talking about Drake streaming Fortnite, and everywhere in between. In today's presentation, we're going to go through some specific examples of platforms, but the tools I'm going to give you today don't care about what platform you're on and should apply to platforms in the future. I'm going to try today to make sure I just talk about risk. Lawyers like to say you have to do X or you can't do X. And to the extent I can, what I'm going to try and do is identify high-risk practices that you might be tempted to engage in, and then give you some lower-risk alternatives that might accomplish the exact same marketing goal while reducing the risk that the FTC calls you and that you would eventually have to call me. Today's presentation is going to be limited to US federal law, and that's for a couple reasons. The first reason is I know you guys come from all over the country and all over the world, and I want to make sure the tools I give you today are going to be applicable to what you do. And the other reason is, quite frankly, right now the FTC is the major enforcement entity in the United States, and so that's the most relevant in terms of figuring out what your risks are and how to avoid them. So there's going to be three parts to my presentation. The first thing I'm going to talk about is when you need a disclosure, when you have to do anything at all. Every post on social media doesn't need a disclosure or a disclaimer, and we're going to talk about what posts do and what don't. And then the second part of the presentation, we're going to talk about what those disclosures look like. How do you let people know that there's a connection between you and the influencer? And then the third part of today's presentation, we're going to talk about what you do when you mess up. Because a fact of life is your influencers aren't always going to have the disclosures they need to have. And so we'll talk about what you do in that situation. I want to be clear when I say social media endorsements that I mean both explicit and implicit endorsements. We kind of know what an explicit endorsement is, right? That's someone creating a video and putting it online and saying, this is the best game I've played in 12 months. But we're also talking about implicit endorsements. Think about the esports player who wears their HyperX headphones. I already said this covers any person from your grandmother to Drake. And it's about any product or service. We'll be talking about games today for an obvious reason. But to the extent your company also is in other industries, you're also creating movies, you're in other spaces, these rules apply there too. Okay, so let's start with the core rule. So the FTC has thousands of pages of guidance, but it all really comes from this guy here on the board that I put up in 4 colors. It's this rule. It's if there's a connection between an endorser and the marketer that consumers would not expect, and it would affect how consumers evaluate the endorsement, that connection should be fully disclosed. The first 3 colors up there, the yellow, the blue, and the red, when all 3 of those are met, then you have what's called a material connection. That'll be the first part of my presentation. What a material connection means, you'll hear me say it again and again in the presentation, but that's just any connection that needs to be disclosed. The green up there is then what you have to do if there's a material connection, which is fully disclosed, and we'll talk about how to do that. And then I already told you in the last part of this presentation, we'll get into how to make sure your influencers are doing their job, or as an influencer, what to do if you mess up. If you take nothing else away from today's presentation, here's what today means for you. If you're a social media influencer and you create content related to a game that has either paid you to create that content or if it's otherwise established a connection with you, you need to include a disclosure. You need to let your followers know that you have that connection. On the flip side, if you're a publisher or you're a game developer and you hire an influencer to create content for your game, you need to give your influencer guidance on how to properly disclose, and you need to make sure they're doing it. You need to monitor. So let's start with a real-world example. This is Syndicate. I'm not sure I'm going to do the voice correctly, but I'll give it a try. He tweets out, "Bruh, I've won like $8,000 worth of CSGO skins today on CSGO Lotto. I can't even believe it." Now, Syndicate's still under investigation for some potential gambling violations, but he's already gotten in trouble for this tweet. And it wasn't because the tweet was endorsing gambling, although that's another problem. The problem with this tweet really is that last phrase there, "I can't even believe it." And the problem is it's a little difficult to believe he couldn't believe it because he was running the site, right? He went on his own site and won a bunch of money. What a surprise. And so the FTC came after him and entered into a settlement with him because he didn't disclose that he was connected to the site, that he was the owner of the site. So one situation in which you'll have one of those material connections is you own the company or you make the game, right? I mean, that's real simple, but that if you have those connections, that needs to be clear to your users. Okay. Throughout today's presentation, I'm going to be going through a hypothetical so that we can cover lots of different situations you might encounter. And in my hypothetical, we have a game developer, Shady Corp. And I call them that because, as you'll see, some of the things they do are a little shady. To make it simple, they're going to have released a game called Drawn Out Chess. This is a classic game of chess, but they have skins for it. That's how they monetize. They sell what they call chess sets, and that's how they make their money. It's for PC and mobile, and they've just launched their game, and they're going to engage in a marketing campaign. And we're going to talk about different practices they engage in and which require a disclosure and which don't. Okay, so here's what Shady Corp does. The first thing they do is they go on Twitter, on their official corporate Twitter account, and they post about the game. Can they do that? The answer is yeah, they can do that, and they don't need a disclosure. That might seem like it's contradictory with what I just put up on the board about Syndicate, because he went and posted about his company, and he needed a disclosure. The difference is this is an official corporate account. And at least in my hypothetical, I'm assuming that's an account that has had lots of tweets about the company, that has a handle that is clearly from the company. And so users are going to understand that the game developer is sending out this tweet. And as long as consumers would already understand that, you don't need a disclosure. So in our next example, the CEO then goes home that day, and he posts on his YouTube channel a video of him playing the game. Does he need a disclosure? Maybe. And I say maybe because it depends what his channel looks like. If he just happens to really be into strategy games and has a channel of all sorts of games from all sorts of developers, and he uses an alias that doesn't make it clear that he's the CEO of this company, then yeah, he's got to let his followers know that he's the CEO of Shady Corp when he posts that video. But if it's clear from his YouTube channel, if it's like the Twitter account, where it's clear that it's from the company, then he doesn't need a disclosure because consumers already know. If we go back to this colorful slide here, right, that blue part, that consumers wouldn't expect. So if consumers already expect there's a connection between you and the game or the company you're tweeting about, you don't have to worry. You're done. You don't need to worry about any of the rest of these rules. Okay. So what about the third thing here? This is something obviously a lot of games do. You release your game, and you send it to some websites that review games, professional critics. Do professional critics have to have a disclosure? The answer there is no, and it's for the same reason. It's that consumers assume that when a critic reviews a product, whether it's a movie critic or a book critic or a video game critic, they are receiving that product for free. And because consumers expect that, those websites don't have to post disclosures. In practice, they often do, but they don't have to. But what about doing something very similar? Sending free copies of your game to a bunch of Twitch streamers. The answer there is yes. Those streamers have to disclose that they got the game for free. Or I shouldn't say have to. I said I was going to try and avoid saying you had to do things. So I'd say there's a risk that the FTC will come knocking if those streamers don't include a disclosure. We'll talk later about what that disclosure has to look like. Okay, so our takeaways are that social media posts clearly from a product's creator don't need a disclosure. The second takeaway is receiving a free copy of a game or anything else of value creates a material connection that needs to be disclosed. Third takeaway is professional critics don't need a disclosure, but then the exception to the exception is the FTC currently doesn't consider YouTubers or Twitch streamers to be professional critics, even if they're being critics in their game stream. Okay. So we're going to continue our hypothetical. Now it's maybe a couple weeks after the release of the game. The game's had decent sales, but the reviews in the App Store and on Steam aren't doing that well. So Shady Corp decides they're going to create an in-game prompt to ask their users to review their game. We see this all the time in mobile, less often on PC and console, although it's there too. And their marketing team comes to them with 3 proposals for potential prompts. And I want to walk through what the risks in these different prompts might be, and we'll go with what, at the end, what I think is probably the best strategy. So the first prompt that they propose inserting in their game is this one on the right here. It says, take a moment to review drawn-out chess. You'll unlock the exclusive Ninja chess set. And it gives 2 options. One is, no, I don't want my free skins. I don't want my free chess set. And the other is, yeah, I love ninjas. Let's do this. And if the user clicks yes, then they go to the App Store, and they also get the free skin. Now, because of the ecosystem, the game developer doesn't know if they actually rated it once they got to the App Store, but it directed them there. And if they say no, they just keep playing the game. So I already told you receiving a free game creates a material connection. What about receiving a free item in a game that you can't transfer anywhere else? Well, right now, the FTC's opinion is that creates a material connection. For those of you in the room who sometimes deal with gambling law and how to make sure you're not violating gambling law, this is different. It's a different outcome here. Normally, in the context of games, we don't consider an in-game item to be something of value unless you can sell it on some other marketplace. But for the purposes of social media influencer disclosures, giving your player anything, including a skin that doesn't affect their gameplay, counts as something of value. So if Shady Corp decided to use this prompt, they would have to make sure, or at least attempt, to get their consumers to disclose that they got a free prompt within their review. In practice, that's going to be really hard. There are ways you could do it, but it's difficult and expensive and difficult to monitor. So I don't like this as a method of trying to get more people to review your game, not because you can't do it, because it's really difficult to do, and inevitably you're going to have consumers who don't disclose that they got the free skin. So let's talk about some other examples you might use to increase the rating of your game or get more reviews that are lower risk. So first, look at the example on the left here. It says enjoying drawn-out chess. And this time it's giving the player 3 options. First option is yes, rate it now. That option will take them to the App Store, like in the previous example. Second option is no, send feedback. What this option does is it pulls up a prompt within the game that the user can then write feedback. And maybe as a developer, you decide to read it, maybe you don't, but for the purposes of reviews, what you're doing is you're directing the user away from the App Store. And then the third option is just to smish. You do neither. This is what we call divergent prompting. The attempt here is to filter users who don't like your game away from the review stores and users who do like your game there. I would call this practice moderate risk. This is probably better than giving your player a free in-game item from the purpose of enforcement, but it's still risky. And if you're going to do something like this, the big piece of advice I have for you is make sure you're being clear with your players what button does what. So there are games where they use this, except for there aren't 3 buttons. There's just a rate the game, and it gives the user 5 stars. And when that user rates the game 5 stars, it takes them to the App Store. But when they rate it 1, 2, 3, or 4 stars, it keeps them within the game ecosystem. Doing that is an area that I think is very likely to be enforced in the near future. So if you're going to go with this strategy on the left here, divergent prompting, at least make clear to your players what's going on so that if they hate the game, they can at least say, yes, rate it now, because they know where that button takes them. But as you might have guessed, the solution I like best for trying to get your users to have more reviews and better reviews is this third one on the right here. So in our hypothetical, this says 5-game hot streak. Here's just won 5 chess games in a row. Take a moment to rate drawn-out chess before you get back to dominating. And then it gives the user the classic 2 options. Yeah, review the game, and no, I don't want to review the game. What this prompt is doing is we're not trying to filter out users. What we're doing is we're displaying the prompt at a time when the users are likely enjoying their experience. My guess is that if somebody just won 5 games in a row in a matchmaking system where it's 50-50 odds, basically, they're probably feeling pretty good. And so when these users go to the App Store, they'll probably give it higher ratings. But you're not being deceptive here. You're not bribing your user into giving you a better rating. You're not trying to say some users can't rank your game and not. You're just putting the prompt at a time that users are likely enjoying the experience. And you can work with your analytics people, whether they're in-house or outside of the game, to figure out what's the moment in your game when players are really enjoying it, and then just queue up that classic, would you like to review this app now prompt then. I think that's the lowest risk strategy if you're looking for a way to increase reviews within the App Store environment. Okay, so our takeaways. Giving compensation to users for reviewing your game, even in-game aesthetic items that cannot be traded, creates one of those material connections, so you're going to need a disclosure. Or it's going to be risky to not have a disclosure. Second takeaway is the FTC hasn't yet enforced against divergent prompting, but I would be careful if you do it. If you do it, make sure you're being upfront with your players about what's going on. And then the third point is creative timing of when you schedule a please review my app prompt within your game is probably the lowest risk alternative to boost your reviews without the FTC coming and giving you a call. Okay, so we've talked about when you need a disclosure. Now what I want to talk about is what those disclosures look like. So we're going to continue our hypothetical, but now we're going to introduce Tina, the Twitch streamer, who is someone that Shady Corp Games has hired to promote their game. And this is a hypothetical tweet she sends out. It says, I love my new pirate chess set in drawn out chess. I'll be streaming it here, and gives a link. And then she has some hashtags. She says hashtag R, she's a pirate. Okay. Hashtag old school gamer. Hashtag partner, and hashtag streaming. So if it wasn't clear, and this is purposefully not a clear slide, the attempted disclosure is hashtag partner. What Tina is saying is she's partnered with the game, and she's at least attempting to let her audience know that, and she includes this hashtag. So let's talk about what's okay and what's wrong here. So first thing that I want to make clear is there's no magic sentence of legalese that you should say when you're making a disclosure. You can disclose in any format, and yes, that includes hashtags. So there's no rule that says your disclosure can't be in a hashtag. Problem here is that partner is a little ambiguous. And when the FTC has looked at cases like this, they've said, we don't think your audience really knows what partner is. And they've given some suggestions for better hashtags you might use. They're a little bit clearer. So the FTC's favorite hashtag is hashtag ad, #AD. It's really short. It only takes up 3 characters. And it's very clear what's going on. Marketing teams don't always like hashtag ads so much. It seems a little hard, right? It's a little in your face, sort of breaks the narrative that the influencer is trying to create, that they actually support the product. So some other options are hashtag sponsored, hashtag the company's name with an underscore partner, or the company's name with an underscore ambassador. They don't like partner, but if you put your company's name in front of it and then an underscore and then partner, they like that. And they call that disclosure sufficient, which means be very low risk. The other problem with this hypothetical is that the hashtag is in the middle of a bunch of hashtags at the end, what the FTC refers to as being lost in a sea of hashtags. And the thought is that when a user sees this, they'll probably read the text, and they might just read none of the hashtags because there's so many of them. So if you're going to make a disclosure through a hashtag, put your hashtag at the front and ideally don't have more than 2 other hashtags after it. More hashtags you have, the greater risk you have. So our takeaways are disclosures can take many forms, even hashtags. Second takeaway here is the FTC has only officially approved a limited number of hashtags. Those are hashtag ad, hashtag sponsored, hashtag your company's name partner, and hashtag your company's name _ ambassador. That doesn't mean there aren't others that work. That just means that right now there have been cases where they've said those all definitely work. So if you use those, very low risk. On the flip side, the FTC has a bunch of hashtags they really don't like. And so I wouldn't use any of these because then you're almost tempting the FTC to come after you. Those hashtags are hashtag SP, hashtag spawn, hashtag collab, hashtag partner, hashtag consultant, hashtag ambassador, and this one, which I think is a little surprising, hashtag thank you _ and then the company's name. The reason they don't like that last one is their thought is maybe the influencer bought the game themselves and they just really like the game. You know, they've been playing Surviving Mars all weekend and they just really want to thank Paradox, even though they don't have a relationship with them. And the final takeaway here is that you have to have your disclosures not in a sea of hashtags. So if you're going to use a hashtag, ideally not more than 3 hashtags and make it the first hashtag in the list. Okay, so now we're going to go back to a real-world example here. This is PewDiePie. This is the actual YouTube page you get to for his video that was sponsored by Warner Brothers. And when you go to PewDiePie's page, this is what it looks like. And like most YouTube videos, below it there's a Show More button, which brings up this incredibly readable block of text. Within that block of text, there's a disclosure. It says this video was sponsored by Warner Brothers. It's misspelled, but it's a disclosure. And at the beginning of his video, he says, I had the opportunity to check out the demo of this game at Gamescom. The FTC came after Warner Brothers for not giving sufficient advice on how to disclose here. And what was their issue? Their big issue here was that users had to click a button in order to see the disclosure. It's what they call below the fold. And quite frankly, they're right. Most users don't click the See More button when they go to a YouTube page and look at the description. This also applies in other context. Think about something like Instagram, where if you have too many sentences, it gets cut off. That means for those platforms, your disclosure needs to be in those first 4 sentences, so users don't have to click a button. It also means it's going to be very risky if you try and have your disclosures in, say, your terms of use, and just hope your users go and click to read it. They need to be visible. They need to be above the fold. Other thing I want to point out about this case is allegedly, I don't know how much he was actually paid, but according to the FTC, PewDiePie was paid about $20,000 for this video. And even though they complained about it, in the final settlement, there was no mention of disclosure for the amount of money. And we've consistently seen that in future cases going forward. So if you were worried that you were paying your influencer a lot of money or giving them a lot of free product and that they were going to have to disclose that and that might cause some backlash in your community or your competitors might start finding out what your marketing spend was, don't worry. You never have to say how much you paid someone. You have to make it clear that it's sponsored that you paid them, but you never have to tell them how much. So I've put up, in case you want to look at it, I don't think it's particularly readable, but basically what that paragraph says is what I talked about for the above the fold. Don't make your users click a button to go see your disclosure. Second bullet up there is what I just said. You don't worry, you don't have to disclose the amount you have paid your influencers if you go and hire them. Okay, so we're going to go back to our hypothetical now. And now Tina, the Twitch streamer, is actually running a Twitch stream. And I want to talk about what that disclosure looks like on Twitch. It's a little easier to think about in the context of something written, because you have time to prepare it. And as a developer or studio, you can actually send your influencer the exact text you want them to use. Of course, in the context of Twitch, it's live. The user's streaming. And so let's talk about how you would make that disclosure. So the first thing is the lowest risk practice is that in the beginning of any video, whether that's a fixed length video like YouTube or that's a Twitch stream, at the very beginning you want to have both a text-based and an audible disclosure, at least if your video has audible content. In addition to that first disclosure, if you have a video that isn't fixed length, think about a live stream, you have two options. You can either have periodic disclosures or you can have constant disclosures. Sort of self-explanatory, although let's talk about them. A periodic disclosure means every once in a while you have a disclosure. And you're probably thinking right now, well, how often is that? Man, that's a great question. Been waiting for years for the FTC to tell us, and they still haven't, so I have two answers for you. First is the complicated, but probably the best answer, which is every time you have a churn of more than 50%, that means you're at a point where most of the people watching your stream weren't watching it the last time you disclosed, you should disclose again. Now, in practice, that's really difficult to figure out. Right? You don't necessarily have the live analytics, and even if you do have historical analytics, they might change from time to time. So the short answer I'm going to give you is once an hour. That answer may change in the future, but based on what I've seen and based on my discussions in the job that I have, I think once an hour is something I would be comfortable defending. I think that's very low risk. Another strategy I have when you're working with influencers is once an hour can seem sort of rote, right? In theory, you can have a timer and they can disclose every hour. But sometimes a better strategy is if they're playing a game that takes place in rounds. Think about Fortnite or PUBG or Hearthstone or StarCraft. If they're playing a game like that, have them disclose every round, or if the rounds are short, every couple rounds, so that they're disclosing at least once an hour. For the moment, I think that's the lowest risk practice, and that may change in the future, but that would be my recommendation for the moment. Now, I said there were two options. There was periodic and constant. Constant doesn't mean your influencer is just there on the stream constantly saying, I got this game for free, I got this game for free, I got this game for free. What that means is that after the initial audible disclosure, there's a block of text that's always on the screen. Marketers tend not to like this. In the game industry, it's really frustrating because it can obscure the game itself. So generally, periodic disclosures are better. But where constant disclosures work well is when you as a company are working with an influencer who just can't remember to disclose. We know those people, right? They're not being malicious, they just can't remember. And if you're working with them and they just keep forgetting, maybe think about putting a block of text on the screen either above or below them. Another trick with the constant disclosures that's really frustrating is if those disclosures are blocked by an ad, then no one's going to see them. So it can get complicated in that maybe on YouTube it's fine, but then you upload it to another platform and the ads appear below the video and it's obscured. But again, if you really have someone who can't remember, think about that as a strategy. So our takeaways are disclosures in videos should appear at the beginning of the video, including both an audible and a text-based disclosure is the lowest risk practice. If a video is part of a stream, there needs to be either periodic or constant disclosures. FTC hasn't told us what periodic means. If you instead choose to use a constant disclosure, that would be a text disclaimer at the top or bottom, but remember, make sure your ads aren't covering it up. Okay, so I told you there'd be 3 parts to today's presentation. I've talked to you about when you need a disclosure and about how that disclosure should look. So now let's talk about what happens a lot when you mess up. Or one of your influencers that you're hiring forgets to include the disclosure. Nowadays, it's not uncommon to work with 500 influencers, and one of them is probably not going to do their job. So what I've put up on the screen here is a real-life case. This is actually one of the earliest FTC enforcement cases, and it was Microsoft's promotion of the Xbox One. And so what Microsoft did is they went and they hired Starcom MediaVest to run a marketing campaign. And they, in turn, hired Machinima to recruit some influencers to promote the Xbox One. And then Machinima paid influencers to post videos about the Xbox One. And some of those influencers didn't include a disclosure, and the FTC did an investigation. But Microsoft didn't end up getting in trouble. So let's talk about why. You might be tempted to think they didn't get in trouble because they're all the way up the chain. And that's not the right answer. You are welcome to delegate your marketing and delegate this responsibility, but that isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card. It's your obligation as the company that initiates the spend, so Microsoft in this example, to make sure those influencers receive the guidelines and actually put them up. But Microsoft didn't get in trouble here for two reasons. One, they had a robust compliance program where they sent each influencer guidelines on how they need to disclose. And not only did they do that, they monitored the influencers, and they noticed that some weren't disclosing, and once they noticed some weren't disclosing, they did a broader campaign, figured out all the influencers who hadn't disclosed, and then they did the really important thing here, they made them fix it. They went to their influencers and said, either take down the video or add a disclosure. So you're not always going to get in trouble here as a company just because you have one influencer who makes a mistake. The key is that there should be some monitoring of what your influencers are doing and then correcting the issues when you find them. I'd also like to point out monitoring doesn't mean you have to look at every single post. You can do that, and that's probably the lowest risk strategy, but you don't have to. Particularly if you have an ongoing influencer who's creating content all the time, maybe once a week, maybe once every 2 weeks, check in, and then if you see a problem with an influencer, go back and look at all the rest of their posts. So our takeaways here are regular, robust monitoring is a best practice. If a non-compliant post or video is identified, that should be corrected, either by adding the correct disclosure or taking that content down. You're welcome to delegate marketing or monitoring, but that delegation is neither a defense nor an excuse, right? You don't have to do it, but if you do it, you still have to watch out for yourself. And finally, I've put up an FTC recommendation here that I don't know how viable it is in practice when you're working with influencers in the real world, but is at least a creative recommendation from the FTC. And their advice is don't pay your influencers until you've reviewed their post. And if their posts don't have the correct disclosure, then they don't get paid. Okay, that's probably a really good way to make sure your influencers do their job and include an accurate disclosure. Not sure how well it would work in the context of actually working with influencers, but it's a strategy to consider, and if you've had an influencer who keeps forgetting to include a disclosure, maybe a strategy you want to think about in terms of how do I get this particular influencer who I've had problems with to keep promoting my game but include that disclosure I've asked them to. So let's take a look about what that looks like in practice. Because it's sort of easy in the abstract to think, oh yeah, I monitor, and when I see something wrong, I correct it. But sometimes you get posts that, they're a little on the edge. So we're going back to our hypothetical here, but we're going to flash forward another 2 or 3 months. So if you remember from earlier in our presentation, Tina was paid some money to send out some tweets, to do some Twitch streams, to create some YouTube videos. She was paid that money over a 2-week period. She fulfilled her contract. She's done. And because Shady Corp has really good monitoring, they noticed 4 months later, she sends out this Instagram, right? And so I know the text's a little small. What it says at the bottom there is looks like someone just leaked the pawn skin in Drawn Out Chess's upcoming Russian-themed chess set. So what's Tina doing here? She's making a political commentary, right? And so your monitor comes to you, and here she is like, man, I don't know what to do. Because we paid her, but that was like 3 or 4 months ago. Is she still an influencer for us? This post is about our game, but it's not really about our game. Do we have to tell her she has to go put up a disclosure? So why don't we break down those rules? So first, the simple one. Everything I've talked about today applies to what we call commercial speech. That's a lot of things, but one thing it's definitely not is this post. So unless you have a contractual commitment otherwise, your influencers are free to post this content, and no, she doesn't need a disclosure here. But I think actually the harder question is, what do we do with the fact that she was paid 3 months ago and isn't technically working for you now, but she's still talking about your game? Let's say this was just like her previous tweet, clearly about the game. Do we need a disclosure then? And I think the answer there is a little surprising. So the first answer is, if you give someone a free copy of your game, according to the FTC, they have to post a disclosure about that game forever. It means they're still playing your game 4 years from now. In theory, they still need to say, hey, I just want to let you know I got a free copy of this game. That's really onerous, right? In practice, I'll be curious to see if the FTC actually goes after those users that far in the future. But at least in theory, that's a practice that could get you in trouble. So let's call it a moderate risk practice. But what about someone like Tina, who is paid to run a promotion over 2 weeks? Well, Tina only has to disclose for the period of her promotion. And once she's fulfilled her contractual obligation, she no longer has to disclose. This might not seem to make a lot of sense, because maybe Tina was paid a lot more money than the person who got the game for free. The way you can get around this is, rather than just send free copies of your game to a bunch of influencers, to the extent you can, the extent you're able to do this, and I get that in the process of marketing it can be difficult, but if you're able to instead enter in a contract with them and say, I'll give you $60 or whatever the price of your game is to do one Twitch stream of my game. And then once that contract's fulfilled, they don't have to keep disclosing, which is going to be a lot easier for them and a lot easier for you as a game developer monitoring what your influencers do. Final thing I wanted to bring up with this tweet is, you might be tempted when you're hiring influencers to put restraints on what they can do even once the promotion's done, right? This doesn't seem crazy. I totally get it, right? You have an influencer and you want to say to him, look, if you say a racial slur in the next year, I want my money back, because that's not my brand and that's not how I want to promote my brand. It's worth thinking about when you're drafting your contracts, what sort of restraints you want to put on the conduct of your influencers for the future. But I told you that when somebody has a contract, they only have to disclose for the length of that contract. And that means if you're putting restrictions on your influencers that go far beyond the promotional period, they have to keep disclosing when they play your game for that whole period. So there's a little give and take here, right? You gain more control, but then you also have more obligations in terms of monitoring. So something to think about when you're working with influencers and recruiting them. Okay, so our takeaways here are, there's no official guidance on how long after an event establishes a material connection, but based on those thousands of pages and all those settlements, the period's likely indefinite if the influencer receives the game or other product for free with no corresponding obligation. But on the flip side, the period's likely limited to the length of the contract or obligation if one is imposed. Very low risk for companies for posts featuring the game after the contractual term. Somewhat more risk for the influencers, but at the moment, we haven't seen any enforcement actions like that, and there's absolutely no risk for political speech. If you're an influencer in the room and you're making political commentary, you can say whatever you want, and you don't have to worry about disclosures. And the final point, restrictions on content in social media beyond the promotional period may be useful to preserve your brand image, but keep in mind, if you impose them, then you have to keep monitoring, and your influencer has to keep disclosing for whatever the length of that contract is. So that's my presentation. That's when you need to disclose, what they should look like, and how to monitor. I've put my contact info up on the board. And for now, I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Hello. Just have a quick question. How does this change for free-to-play games? If there's no direct monetary compensation to, say, a partner program that we're running, and we give them in-game items as compensation, Is that different than giving them direct money, essentially?
Sure. So I would need to know more about what the program itself looks like. But generally, giving someone in-game items to promote your game triggers all these obligations, just as if you'd given them cash, right? I think that's a surprising result, and hopefully I can do my job better and convince the FTC that that's not the right result. But for now, they're treated just like somebody you paid cash.
Hi. Thanks, great talk. Just a quick question. We were talking about the FTC here. So what about companies which are based outside the US? And let's say even the influencer is let's say a British guy or girl. And then, we sell the game on Steam, and clearly Twitter is based in the US. So how does that work?
Sure. So that's a great question. If your game is sold in the United States and the influencers you're hiring are creating content that's most likely going to be viewed in the United States, then these rules apply. As a practical matter, the FTC is less likely to come after you because it'd be a pain for them, right? They'd have to go abroad. There's a whole bunch of legal rules they'd have to follow. So you're probably a little bit safer, but formally these same rules apply. Great. Well, if I don't have any more, oh, sorry, go for it.
So I have an interesting situation that came up recently in the past. One of my influencers paid cash and bought their own copy of the game, but I gave them copies for them to distribute for free to their streamers. Even though they weren't streaming the copy that I bought them, are they forever now have to disclose, or did they only have to disclose in the stream in which they gave away the free copies?
I think it would be very low risk to continue forward without disclosing. I think that's a great example of how do we work within the rules to not make our influencers have this weight that's dragging them down forever. If they bought the game, within the stream where they're giving them out, they have to disclose they got the copies of those games from the game developer, from you. But as long as they're disclosing within that stream and aren't giving out free copies in the future, that's enough, and I'd be very comfortable with that situation.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks. Great talk. I have maybe a tangent. Maybe this is a better offline discussion, but I'm curious about the relationship between streamers in particular and the platforms themselves. Incentivization of using certain types of features that are known to keep engagement, and the financial relationship between platforms like Twitch and streamers. Is there any additional required disclosure from the platform context about the financial relationship between people in that platform?
Sure. No, that's an interesting question. I think the short answer is no. So at least in the near future, the FTC enforcement is going to be focused on the influencers and on the companies that paid them initially. And platforms can kind of sit on the sidelines. Although in practice, they are developing tools, right? Like, so YouTube now has a tool where if some of the products in your video are sponsored, it will display a little disclosure about that. And so you can use those tools. Sometimes those tools won't necessarily perfectly line up with what I just talked about here, but I don't think the platforms themselves have an obligation.
You talked about the idea of creating contracts with streamers or influencers and saying instead of giving you X game for free, let's give you X amount of money. That would then free up some of that long-term obligation for disclosure. Should streamers be thinking about requesting those kinds of contracts when looking at influencing games?
Absolutely, to the extent they're able to. So I think these, as we saw in the presentation, the real-world examples of both the FTC coming after the influencer and the company themselves. I realize in practice it can be hard because sometimes someone just sends you a free copy of the game and it's, you send them an email and say, hey, could you, send me some money instead and I'll just buy the copy, and they never respond. So I get that it can be difficult in practice. But to the extent you can do that, yeah, that would be great and definitely reduce your risk.
Hey, Nate Blair, High Res Studios. Two questions. One probably pretty straightforward and easy. One tiny bit more maybe. Employees that are not paid to do the streaming they are doing, I presume you would advise that they acknowledge the fact they're an employee in the streams they are doing. Thoughts on that? Second question being, what about your esports players who They're playing in your leagues. You are not specifically paying them to stream, but nevertheless, they do have connections back to the league, back to the teams, et cetera.
Sure, so I think you're right. The first question is easy. The employees, that's the CEO of the YouTube channel I talked about. The employees need to disclose if it's not already clear from the content they're creating that they're an employee, which often it's not. Sometimes it is, but that needs to be made clear in some manner. To the esports question, I think that we'll go all the way back to this rule here that I put up in a bunch of colors. So I think the answer here comes down to the blue. Do consumers understand that the esports athletes are being paid to promote the product? I think the answer is probably yes, at least within the official setting of the game environment. So when you go to a tournament and you see them playing on certain computers or using certain headphones, my guess is most consumers understand that that's sponsored, right? That they're paid to do that, and so there probably doesn't need to be a disclosure there. But in the short term, maybe, particularly as esports grows and it becomes more established and these norms get figured out, maybe it would be good to have a disclosure.
Thanks.
Great talk, thank you. There's discussion with cryptocurrencies and making contracts in those exchanges. How does the FTC view the contract within a cryptocurrency in the discussion of creating a disclosure? Because it's not regulated at this point, is there any more risk when dealing with a contract inside of a cryptocurrency?
I just want to clarify your question. Sure. Are you talking about paying influencers of cryptocurrency, or are you talking about a contract that is structured within cryptocurrencies so that the payment's only delivered once they fulfill some obligation?
The latter.
The latter. Okay. There's no additional risk because you're using cryptocurrency. Doesn't mean you're free of risk, but there's no reason that should change the risk profile for anything you're doing.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Hey, do the disclosure requirements also encapsulate media channels that aren't personal brands? So for example, if it's a media channel, it's just like a passion page or something like that, do we have to disclose that we were paid to do that advertisement if it's not like our personal brand promoting it, just like a news channel?
Yes. There's a platform agnostic, so to speak. That's a big word for we don't care what you're on and we don't care what you do. And, I think this slide here, right? Any person, explicit or implicit, product or service, right? I mean, pretty broad scope into which this applies. Mm-hmm. So if you're talking about just like a blog and maybe it's not your personal blog or maybe it's a news website or something, absolutely. An example where we see that come up is sponsored content on, think about like Polygon, it'd be like from our sponsors, right? They make clear that this is actually an ad that's like an article, but it was sponsored. And you have to make clear that, that article was paid for, that promotion was paid for.
Okay. So this also is tried and true for bartering tangible goods as well? Like if, say, you were to send a female a t-shirt and she posts about your brand, even though you didn't pay her, like you said, you gave her something for free, she would have to disclose that she somehow partnered with you. Okay, cool, thanks.
Okay, well, thank you guys so much. If there are no other questions, I'll let you guys go, but I do want to remind you to please fill out the evaluations. I know they're sort of a pain for you to fill out, but they're great for us. Helps us learn what you guys enjoyed, what you didn't, and how next year I can be even better. So thank you.